Hello and welcome to Spring Office Hours, episode number 53, Structuring Your Spring Boot Applications. My name is Dan Vega, Spring Developer Advocate at VMware. Today I am joined by a special guest. Deshaun is out in Singapore for VMware Singapore. So I am joined by a good friend of mine, Ted Young, also known as Jitter Ted. Ted, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. This is one of my favorite topics. As you know, anything that involves anything close to testing is always something I love. You can't shut me up about.
Yeah, so I had a lot of conversations about kind of structuring your code. Why would you do certain things? How can we test it? And you were the first person I thought of. I said, I have to talk to Ted. And I was telling you before the show, and I want to tell everybody else, I was watching some of your content, and I was just like, what a geek I am, because I could just sit here and listen to your like train of thought of the way you're going through, like trying to solve a problem. I could go through that all day. So for those of us, there might be a couple people out there. I know it's probably a small minority, but for those who don't know Ted, Jitter Ted, can you give us an intro? Like, who are you? What are you up to? What are you doing these days? Let the people know who you are.
Yeah. So I'm known as Jitter Ted on pretty much all the social media. That name comes from the name of a guinea pig. They used to do this thing that we call them Jitter Pig. So Jitter Ted sounded like a good thing. And also I drink a lot of coffee. So there you go for that. What I'm doing, what I'm up to is, as always, for me, testability is paramount. And so I've done a lot of talking about hexagonal architecture. One of the first presentations I did was 2018. And really for me, it's not like I said, I need an architecture. Let me go find one. Oh, that one looks good. For me, it's always about, I need to test my code. How can I test my code? And how do we separate things to test things? And so this is what I do. I basically either do training, and so I teach people not just hexagonal, not just architecture, but like how do we test our code, and more importantly, these days, or actually forever, our code isn't testable. How do we refactor to get to testable code? So I do a lot of refactoring. In fact, I've got a whole refactoring series of videos coming up that I'm working on. And so I also, as you were mentioning, I stream and I do a variety of things, but I'm always following my process of test-driven development. Whatever architecture makes that easy, and yeah, and I help teams do that as well. A lot of times we do it together in a mob programming ensemble environment, which I find is the most fun way and the best way to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So we're going to get into a lot of things today. I just want to kind of mention for everyone out there, this is our live stream, Spring Office Hours. We do it every Tuesday, usually every Tuesday, 3:30 Eastern time. We are in a live stream right now, but we also turn this into a podcast. If you are listening to this at a later date, that's great. But if you ever want to catch us live, head over to springofficehours.io. You can see our upcoming shows and you can see the archives if you want to kind of dig through those. But we are live here, and I want to go ahead and respond. We have a bunch of people in the chat today. Wow, really big turnout. It must have been for our great guest, Ted. Really excited to see everyone here. We got our friend Simon. Hello, Simon. How are you? Max says hello. Max had an interesting point here. Curious to learn about Spring Modulith project. Max, I got some good news for you. We are going to continue this train of talking to the experts about architecture, and we're going to talk to Oliver soon. So probably in the next few weeks, we'll have an episode with Oliver to talk about Spring Modulith. I didn't want to just get to that yet because I feel like this is an evolution of the things that we're kind of talking about. So we're going to get into some basics today. We're going to get into like package by layer, package by feature. We'll talk about hexagonal, and I think kind of Spring Modulith is like that next step of the evolution. So there's that, Max. Let me see here. Simon says it's quite interesting and useful, Max. I've been using it for a couple months now. If you've used ArchUnit or Akin before, I don't think I've ever heard of Akin. Have you?
I know ArchUnit. I'm not sure what he means. Does he mean like sort of something like it?
Oh, or Akin before. Gotcha. I thought that was a project.
Sounds like a good project.
Cool. Thomas, our good friend Thomas is here. Hello,
hey,
everyone. Oh my gosh, there's just so many. Love it. All right, cool. So if you are in the live chat and you have questions, please go ahead and drop those in. If we don't get to them right away, we'll go ahead and star them and we'll see if we can't get back to them. I do want to mention one thing before we get going here. I'm going to show my screen. If you have not heard, we have a Spring One virtual tour coming up. So if you head over to springonetour.io, there's a kind of intro about this. If you weren't able to be in person for the Spring One in Vegas in August, this is our virtual tour, bringing a lot of that same content, but some new content as well. You can go ahead and register for this for free. It's going to be on October 17th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And again, this is virtual, and the schedule is already up, so you can go ahead and click on the schedule and take a look at everything that's going on. There's a beginner-friendly track, an intermediate, and a platform and stacks. And so I'll be doing a talk on GraphQL there. I'm also emceeing a particular track, so really looking forward to this day. Coming up pretty quickly here, so if you have not registered.
October's not that far away.
It's pretty crazy, right? Like, I'm a summer person. I like warm weather. I'm okay with fall, but I just know what it means. I know you live in the Bay, right?
Yeah.
So I used to live in the Bay for a couple of years, and you guys just don't understand because it gets really cold here. So so I know what's coming. I don't mind fall, but I know what's coming is what bothers me. So yeah, not looking forward to that, but I can't believe it's October already. Oh, it almost is. Okay, so that is the Spring One tour. What we're going to talk about today is kind of structuring your code in your Spring Boot application. So I did a video on this last week, and we'll kind of recap some of this, and also, a lot a lot of the content I've been creating lately, Ted, I've just thrown like tweets out, like throwing spaghetti at a wall and like, who wants to talk about what? And this one like really stuck. That a lot of people had a lot of like really great opinions on this. And so I said, great, this is a good opportunity. This is something I wanted to do for a while. Let's dive into this. And so the premise here is you have an idea for an app. You go over to start.spring.io, you fill in all the metadata, you pick your dependencies based on what you're going to build. You open it up in our favorite IDE, which is IntelliJ.
Of course.
And then what do I do next? Like, I don't know where to start. And I think the idea is there are some best practices out there. Spring Boot is very opinionated, but it doesn't care where you put code. You can kind of split your code up however you want.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were talking about before the show, that could be a good thing or that could be a bad thing.
Yeah.
I happen to like frameworks that kind of tell me like, do this. But I also like the power of, if I don't want to conform to like what everybody else is doing, I want to be able to like have my, spread my creative wings and put stuff where I want to. So I like it. It's kind of the best of both worlds.
Yeah. And I think it's especially, one of the things I do is educate people, and the idea of, look, let's start with a structure because it's going to help us do some other things. And then once you kind of learn your way around and start hitting up against maybe, oh, this structure isn't working for me, or it's too confining, or I need to sort of break some rules. I think it's helpful to have some structure to start. And I actually wish like Spring Boot, the starter would actually introduce some kind of, here's a starter structure. Maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it could even say, for this type of app versus this type of app, this is the structure. But I think opinionated is fine as long as people realize that it's not the only way to do things.
Yeah. And I think, I mentioned that right away in the video. That was like, all right, we're going to go over some things here, but like, no matter which side of the street you lie on, there's not a wrong answer. There are ways, there are pros and cons to doing it certain ways. And I know you definitely like lean one way because of some of the pros that, definitely come into play when you're testing. I know not everybody writes tests, so maybe they don't see some of those pros right away.
Right.
But no matter where you put your code, there is no wrong answer. Now, you will run into a bunch of problems later if you don't find some way of structuring your code.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could literally write all of your code in one file if you wanted to. And we know that's not maintainable, but
you could.
So
for certain like I know it's not Java and Spring, but HTMX is all one file. So HTMX is this popular sort of JavaScript library that makes web UIs easy. But it's all one file. But there's always the rules are made to be broken, right? So rules are good because they provide some guidance. So you can stop thinking about that and you can start thinking about other things. Mm-hmm. And getting hung up on sort of that structure can be sort of like, I'm sure we've all had arguments of like, where do we put these files? And it's like, look, let's just try this. Let's do this. Yes. Let's use this structure. Let's focus on the business, right? Yeah. We're hopefully getting paid to do something. What are we getting paid to do? Let's solve that problem. And then we can discuss, like you said, it's like, well, what's not working for us and what, but really, I think one of the things that I think it's really important to start out with is, what are we trying to do? Like, why package it all? As you said, like we could put it all in one file. Okay, that makes it really hard to work with. It makes it hard for multiple people to work with it. And so you start getting into some of the less technical issues and you really get into the social aspects of your team and your organization.
Mm-hmm. And I think, organizing your code is a lot like writing code inside of one file. I always tell people like the code I start with is never as good as the code I end up with. I'm always like, how do I get this to work? And so I may put a bunch of gibberish on screen and it works. And it's like, okay, let me step back now. I know this is probably not the best way to write it. Let me kind of refactor it and go from there. And that could be the same for structuring your code. You could put a whole bunch of folders in there and throw a bunch of files in different folders and then step back and go, that we're going to have some problems writing tests, or the
Right.
next person who comes along and takes a look at this code is not going to have any clue of what I'm doing here.
Yeah, and you use the magic word refactoring, and I think
Yeah.
that refactoring, if you look at what Martin Fowler popularized it back in the late 90s, and one of the things that refactoring is all about is improving the design of stuff that works. Right? It works, but it's not amenable to change. It's maybe a little hard to understand. Maybe it is hard to test, and so refactoring is the way to say, now that it's done, in the sense that it's providing value to someone. Now let's go refactor it in a way that makes it easier for us to provide continual value over time, because software is never done until it's deleted, and then it's done.
Always in beta.
Yeah, I mean, it is, right? I mean, because the world is moving, what people want is moving, and what, the features we want to add, but also things we want to fix, and new platforms that we have to run on and deploy to, and different ways of distributing the application. All that is changing fast enough that we're always having to sort of do these kinds of things to keep up. And sometimes it's providing new features, and sometimes like, this platform they deleted a service and we're not going to be able to use it anymore. Now we're going to have to switch to something else.
Right. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that these days too. With we talk to a lot of customers who are updating to upgrading to Spring Boot 3 and Java 17, and then a lot of the problems that I see customers having are they use this third-party library or this internal service that they wrote that Java doesn't support Java 17, and so now you're in that same kind of problem. How do we fix this? Do we write our own, or do we find something that works? Or yeah, so I see that a lot. Okay, so what I want to do, I'm going to start, we're going to kind of go through an evolution here, a little bit of a story. I'm going to throw on screen I threw this out last week, and I just want to talk through it because I'll get to some of the comments in here, but I basically started with working on a tutorial for structuring your code in your Spring Boot project. Which side are you on? Because while I think for most of us, this is our starting point. We gotta organize our code somehow. So we create these packages, and we're like, okay, I'm just gonna create some kind of organization and put the code there, and this works. And then for me, my evolution was I always kind of put things in package by layer. This is, for those of you at home, we're looking at a diagram of package by layer versus package by feature. Package by layer is, hey, I have different packages like domain, controller, service, repository, etc. And this is where I always put my code because, I come from the web world, and this is how I would structure my projects in the web world, or the Ruby on Rails, the Groovy on Rails did this. I think for me, that's a lot of it too, because I came from a world where this was convention. It created the packages for me. It put the code in there.
They gave you that structure. Yeah,
they gave me that starting structure, right? And I told you, I like that. That's okay. You tell me that's where I should put stuff, that's where I'm going to put stuff. And so this translated over to the Spring world for me. And I kind of did this blindly, but it also worked. I didn't run into a lot of issues until I got into bigger applications, if you will. And then again, for the demos that I write for tutorials and stuff, I don't think it really matters, but again, you will start somewhere and then start to find some problems later on. Yeah. And so then I talked about package by feature as well. So this is hey, if I'm building this shopping cart system, I may have a package for product. I may have a package for customer, order, cart, and so on. And so this is kind of the starting point. What are your thoughts on package by layer, package by feature?
So I want to say one thing about package by layer, because the layers that you have, domain, controller, service, repository configuration, are pretty similar to sort of what the books that you might read on architecture and things like that talk about. To me, I always think about it, there's really sort of two main things. There is code that has to do with the problem we're trying to solve, which is the domain and maybe service and coordinating with the external thing. Basically, everything that's not I/O, everything that's not touching hardware. So there's that. And then there's everything else that's basically touching IO and hardware and external things. And I always split it down those lines, mainly because whenever I've worked with systems that mix those two together, this idea of mixing IO in with my business rules and processes and what I'm trying to solve, it always makes testing really hard. So for me, that's my primary way of, if I can split into two pieces, that's how I split it. And then it's a matter of refining, okay, what's the domain, what's sort of the inside as hexagonal looks at it, what's the inside part, and then what's the outside part. And then you can basically say, well, the outside part, there's actually two ways we interact with the world. We receive stuff and we're asked to do things, that's sort of incoming things, and then we let other systems know or store information. And so you can sort of think about it as there being inputs and outputs. And then there's in the middle, there's sort of the processing. And to me, that's sort of a nice minimum way of doing it because of some structure. One of the problems I see with package by layer is because there's sort of not enough thought into why are we packaging by layer. One of the things, so I in sort of preparing for this, I basically looked at, gosh, must have been 15, 20 repositories of Spring Boot apps on GitHub. And almost every single one had controllers in its own package, which is fine, except then they had DTOs in a separate package, and then exceptions in its own package, and then models or entities or both in their own packages. And to me, that's no longer packaging by layer, that's just packaging by the classes. And I think that is not understanding what the purpose of packaging is. It's supposed to, right, if we look back at like, what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? Why do we package anything, right? Why do we put anything into classes? It's like you said before, like put it into one big class, then I can find everything.
Right.
And the reason why is and this goes back to decomposing systems that have been talked about for 50 years, is our brains can't work that way. And we also can't work in groups. But even just if we're one of us, we can't comprehend 5,000 lines of detail. So we break things down into abstractions. And so all this stuff is about grouping things together in a way that we can say, okay, this is dealing with persisting stuff in a database. I don't want to think about the details because I'm not focused on that right now. I'm focused on how do I implement this feature of adding a product to a cart and calculating shipping.
Right.
And so when we start with what is the purpose of it, then we can say, okay, how does a language like Java support that, right? Packaging and namespaces allows us to then have another level of abstraction. Say, okay, I don't need to know the details of JSON and HTTP and so on. I just know some request is going to come in. Like, and so we what we're trying to do is basically put all that detail behind a little sign that says, hey, this is IO, or hey, this is how we store stuff in a database.
Right.
And then
Oh, no, go ahead.
And so package by layer then says, we're saying that this kind of stuff is different from this kind of stuff. And then the other aspect is the social sort of, how do we find stuff, right? So the other part of the problem is like, I need to work on feature of, placing the order. Where do I go? Where do I look for stuff?
Right.
And that's a problem because you can't optimize for both. Right. And I think that's why there's so much sort of contention and interest in this kind of thing, is because everybody, it's like this pendulum. Okay, we swing to package by layer because of certain positives that supports, but then we can't find everything having to do with order. So let's swing back the other way.
Right.
And then, well, now we've got stuff mixed up, and now we can't test things correctly because we've got our IO in our, in our domain, our peanut butter and our chocolate, and vice versa. And so we can't, and so there's no good answer that solves both in my experience. You can package by component, but
and that's why a lot of the comments, if you go through, and I'll try to get the links to, I did this on Twitter and LinkedIn. I posted this, got a ton of comments, and there was no, like, it wasn't in favor of one. It was very much split down the middle. Like, This is why I use package by layer. This is why I use package by feature. I even got a bunch of I use both, and I'm like, all right, well, we're gonna argue about that one because I don't know why in a scenario where I would do that, but we'll get to that. So a couple of things while you were talking, I was just thinking of, and I wonder, when you have a strong argument for package by layer or package by feature, I wonder how much testing comes into play because I say this, I often find issues in my code when I start to write tests for them. When I start to write tests, now I'm like, okay, there's too much going on in this one thing. It's no longer, single responsibility of this thing to do that one thing. Tests allow me to find issues in my code. So the more tests I write, I think the better code I end up writing. I don't write them enough, but when I do, I realize that I'm doing the wrong thing here. And so for me, one of the things, with package by layer that I used forever in Spring, tests were starting to show me that, hey, I have, in the package by layer scenario, and we get into like things like cohesion and coupling, I have some high coupling here between these package by layers, and I have some low cohesion here. And so you start to draw the diagrams of like all the things that touch each other and have to call each other. Now I'm running into some issues. So I think testing and just kind of stepping back and looking at some software design principles really kind of made me go, okay, there are some issues with package by layer. Let me check out package by feature.
Yeah, and so like I said before, for me, testing is paramount. And so since I do a lot of test-driven development, it helps highlight those issues right up front. Like, oh, I can't test this because I need a database. And as wonderful as our current environment of test containers and databases is, which it is so wonderful, for me, it's still not fast enough and not reliable enough to use as part of my tight TDD cycle, where I expect my tests to run in less than a second or two. So we need some way to say, look, I'm not testing database storage. I'm testing this flow of I'm adding an item to the cart, and it needs to calculate shipping costs and tax.
What are the inputs and outputs?
And so where does it get the taxes? Well, it has to look it up somewhere. Well, I don't need it to go out to some third-party service right now because I'm not testing that connection. I'm testing, given this information and this other information, do I calculate things correctly and provide this information? And so when we're thinking about those flows and those processes and how to test them, what I'm concerned about when I'm creating that is are the calculations right? Because boy, if you've ever worked in some of these things, especially sales tax, where if it's heated up, it's one tax. If it's not heated up, it's another tax. And what it is and where it's sold and all these kinds of things, it's pretty insane. You want to get that right, and you want to have lots of good tests around that. And so that will show you, okay, it would help if I had a separation between my sort of application and domain layer and the third-party services that are providing some of this information. And that shows you I need a boundary there so that I can say and basically replace, whether it's with Makito, which isn't my preference, or something that I write, that it provides something where it's a known value so I can test it and I'm not relying on anything external, any IO. And so that provides one guidance to separation. But if you don't then have separation between like let's say customer management, there's a whole bunch of stuff there that doesn't really have anything to do with customers placing order, right? And now you've got, well, do you put all that code still in the domain layer? No, you subdivide things. And this is where I think this idea of sort of modular monoliths of saying, okay, for each, and so here's where you kind of can do both, right? You package by feature, but inside the feature, you now package by layer.
Right.
And sometimes this is referred to as vertical slice architecture, and there's some, loose definitions of that. But that's kind of the idea is you separate things, or I separate things based on testability, but also, then we look at sort of cohesiveness and how it fits into the features.
Yeah, and I mentioned some pros and cons of each, and a couple of things that really stuck out for me was, when we start to package by feature, now we get into like the normal rules of Java, because in package by layer, every class that I create is a public class, and everything that I need to expose is now public. When I get into package by feature, it's like, okay, everything inside a product maybe doesn't need to be public. It can be its default package private, and only things within this package can access it. And I think that before we get into like the web world of building Java applications, that's how we write code, right? We don't just make everything public and everything talks to each other, right?
Yeah, I hope not. I mean, back in the old days, that I certainly was guilty of doing that. But I mean, even in package by layer, there's stuff I'm going to have, for example, in my, you haven't called it out in your package by layer, but what I would call sort of the inputs into the system. Maybe it's a UI. I know in chat they were talking about UI. There's stuff in that UI section, maybe it's under controller, like the DTOs, like those don't need to be public. Outside the controller, that layer, who cares? Like those DTOs are specific for that thing. They're contained in there, and they should be packaged private. And so again, the idea of package private is hide the stuff that nobody cares about from the outside. And so the domain could care less about anything else. In fact, the way I look at it is the domain is the center, and it cares not. It is the center of its own world, and it doesn't talk to anybody. It's just fed information and says, do this or calculate this.
Speaking of the comments, I want to get back to, we have a whole bunch of comments in here, and I just want to make sure we're answering some of these questions. Really wish there were some Spring folks at DevOps Morocco next month. There is going to be some Spring folks there. I unfortunately will not be there, but I hope I can make it out there one day. Regarding package by feature, are there guidelines or tips with coming up for feature names and how granular a feature should be? So this is kind of like how big should a microservice be, right? Like it should be as big as it needs to be. And I think this always comes back to refactoring, right? You mentioned an example before, like I might throw everything that has to do with a product in a product package, but then come to realize later that this package is out of control right now. Like I need to find a way to kind of refactor this into different things. So and
I think this is where domain-driven design is so valuable. Like I think to me, hexagonal architecture plus domain-driven design is a wonderful combination, because it gives you a lot of guidance on how big is this thing, what, and again, it comes back to, it's not a code size thing, although there are some factors there, but again, it's the team thing. When your things get too big, I mean, this was the problem. Like I was there in 2011 at the InfoQ's QCon SF conference, where James Lewis introduced a workshop on microservices, 2011. And since then, what gets me is it's been so misunderstood as about scalability, and its main purpose was to solve the problem of, we have 20 engineers. They can't all work in the same package. They can't all work in a code base where they're constantly stepping on each other's toes. And so microservices was a way, let's divide up the code in a way that pays attention to domain-driven design, what's called bounded context, to find that boundary, so we can say, you 4 people go and work on this, and you can make progress without getting stuck behind waiting on somebody else. And that is so valuable in and of itself, and that's what we want. We want to find what are those boundaries where we're starting to sort of bump heads, and we want to figure out how do we, and you're always giving up something, right? Whenever so you may spread stuff out over multiple repositories, and it's like, oh, we have to change something. Well, now instead of just hitting one button to refactor everything, now you've got a slower process, and so there's that trade-off.
Yeah, and you mentioned microservices. I mean, package by feature. If I start to have this product package and this thing explodes, product is a terrible example because this is not something I would split into its own service. But like,
well, it might be the product inventory. Right? I mean, there's a whole
Right.
lot of
Right.
putting products into your catalog. So
Right.
catalog.
So there, when we kind of package our applications this way, now I can look at that and go, okay, this everything in this particular package I have can be split out into a new service. That's really hard to do in package by layer. You got to kind of pull stuff from everywhere
Right.
and
Right.
wrangle things together, and then you have tests in different packages. Like it's hard to kind of pull that out into another service. So
However, it does not have to necessarily be pulled out into a microservice. And this
true.
is what the monolith, the modular
Yes.
monolith
Exactly.
supports
Yeah.
is if there's a clear package separation between your huge catalog management. I worked for eBay way back when, and catalog was an entire huge team, because there's a lot there. But it's you're doing stuff, you're adding products, you're updating products, you're removing products.
Right.
All that work is done separate from it's related to, right? All these things are related to customers buying products, but they are two different, they really are two different things. They are two different bounded contexts as domain-driven design would look at it. And so you want to have that separation. And the way I'd start out is put them in separate packages and maybe even separate jar artifacts still under the same code base, because what you get is the ability to do that refactoring. Do that refactoring of, hey, we're changing the quote internal API, right? The public methods that we're providing on the public classes in this thing for accessing products from the catalog. We want to change it. And we can do that and run tests and do the refactoring, do the automated refactorings to get that done, as opposed to in a microservice. Now you've got to coordinate deployments and changes and backwards compatibility. And so you can do it, but it's harder. And so I always say, like, start with the packaging. When these things get large enough, start with using packages to provide that separation.
I love it. Cool. I hope that answered your question. Hey, I'm just starting out with Java. Which version should I start off with? 21 if you're
21.
just starting out. Grab it. It's good stuff. By feature seems better since a product can have another package of other object. All right. We're currently where to put our front end code in the feature package, source main Java feature UI, or split between UI and backend.
Yeah, so I
This
think
is tough.
I think it's there's no right answer, because it depends, and I think it depends on the complexity. If you have a very small application, and there's not much in product, and there's not much in customer, and there's not much in order, right? They're relatively small. You might just package by layer. But if they're large enough, then you want to say, well, is this UI specific to the product catalog work, adding and updating those products and maybe integrating with other services? Or is it having to do with the customer-facing UI of placing an order? Or does it have to do with the warehouse UI for looking at an order so they can package it? So in that case, the UIs are likely going to be pretty custom to the feature that they are. And so I would say put them under the feature. If you have some administrative kind of UI that maybe is used by all of them, maybe put it somewhere else. From a hexagonal point of view, or just from a UI being or one way of inputs, they tend to not have, nobody depends on those, right? Those are what I consider sort of at the edge of the system. And so they depend on everything else, but nobody depends on them. So it's a bit easier to move them around.
Yeah, and I would say, your requirements are going to drive a lot of this too. There may be scenarios where you have another UI team that's not part of the Spring application. You may have a UI that is always changing and you don't want to redeploy your Spring application. So in that case, maybe your UI is completely separated out into, its own application. So yeah, really a lot of that's going to drive those kind of decisions.
Yeah.
What is your view on packaging as a library jar? So we know that I will import jar or already tested.
So this is really interesting. So if you set up your project, so you're generating a jar for your domain. What's nice is, so like I was saying, it's like domain doesn't depend on anything else. It may depend on some of its own libraries, but it's not calling externally out. the
Right.
way I define domain. And therefore it's great. You can package it up. And now it's this thing that works. And maybe after a while, it doesn't change very often.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's sort of these layers where, the speed of change is pretty slow in the middle. And then, like you were saying, the UI changes a lot. And then you want to make sure that that's easy. So I've played around with this kind of way of having your dependencies and having each one deployed as a jar. I'd be very careful of then saying, okay, now this jar is available to another team that you can depend on, because that's not the way I like to split things up. Like, I don't even want to have a separate UI team. I want to have everybody doing everything all in one team, even if it means switching back and forth between React and Spring. I want everybody on the same team, because what I try to avoid in general in software engineering is handoffs. Handoffs and dependencies between teams are the thing that really slow us down.
Cool. What about packaging by feature and then create sub packages by layer?
Yeah.
So I saw this a lot in the comments.
And that's the way I would do it if it got big enough.
And I think I was just to I think I touched on this earlier, but what I was saying is I don't package by layer and package by feature. But if you want to mix those two, then there are probably some advantages there. And I think I haven't gotten into it yet, but we mentioned it earlier. Spring Modulith is a new project at Spring, just hit 1.0 or hit 1.1, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think to some point, that's kind of what it does. It breaks things down into modules, right?
Yeah.
So, hello guys. Is it worth using Spring Boot for freelancing jobs? Ted, you can speak to this, I think.
If the people you're freelancing for are going to maintain it and they already know Java, then it's great. I mean, one of the nice things about Spring Boot is you get a lot out of the box, and there's a lot of resources like Dan's to learn. And so I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say Java in general, there's, you want to use a technology that you can hand off to the client, that if they need help and it's not you helping them, there's a pool out there.
Right.
And I think, Java definitely has that pool. So how about entities? By layer, everything was connected to a lot of other entities, but by feature, do we still allow that coupling?
So entities is one of those words that is, what do you mean by entity?
Right.
Because they and to me, and this is like POJOs. What does POJO mean? So POJO means two different things. Entities means like 5 different things.
Yeah.
Are you talking about the database entity that's going to be stored by like a JPA or something like that?
Yeah.
Are you talking about an entity, literally the table in the database? Or are you talking about an entity from the domain-driven design standpoint, which is a mutable object that has behavior, that has business meaning, and so on? And this was another thing, as I was looking through all these projects, I'm very sad that just about every single example where they had entities, those entities had almost no behavior. And this is the anti-pattern of an anemic data model. So all the behavior, if it was anywhere, was either in the controllers, which is bad. You don't want domain behavior there. Or was in the service, which is, okay, it's slightly better, but still not good, because you've got these, what I like to say is, look, if you're programming in Java, it's an OO language, do OO. And the problem is the way OO is taught is not very good. And so to me, I'm a big domain-driven design fan. And so that means that entities to me are meaningful things in the domain and take the names from what the domain folks talk about. Catalog, item, product, tax, shipping charge, all those are entities that have specific meanings, that have behavior. And by behavior, I mean there are switch statements and if statements in there. They are making decisions, they're doing comparisons. And so that's behavior. And those should be inside of those objects. Then we have to figure out, well, where do they come from? They don't appear out of nowhere, right? We load them from a database. So, okay, we got to have some way of taking stuff from a database. And I'm not a fan of JPA. And I think this is where I agree with Oliver is I'm much more of a fan of Spring Data JDBC, where it's like, do some of the, low hanging fruit stuff for me, but I don't need like dirty checking and all this kind of other stuff. But anyway, but there needs to be some way of in order to execute a method of like figure out the shipping charge for this order and load that stuff into memory. You got to load it into memory. Where you're going to load it from, you're probably a repository of some sort. And so you have to be careful about talking about those entities. In terms of coupling, again, that's where you can have your domain entities coupled with your database entities, because they have to be. They're storing the things, and you're pulling the data out, and you're storing those, and that's generally fine. What you don't want is coupling across features, and that's where it can get a little tricky. And this is where, again, this idea of a bounded context of what is product catalog concerned with? Well, it talks about products, but a very different point of view from your order, right? Your order, the word product in your order world may have description and price. In the product catalog, it may have who we're buying it from, who's our vendor, what's our cost, right? The same product linked by some identifier, but they have two different points of view and two different sets of information.
Right. Okay, cool. I want to get into hexagonal architecture. I just want to look one more question here. Could you also talk about splitting an application into multiple Maven modules? So this is another thing. So we could split we can start to organize our code inside of a single application. And then we can also have an application that's made up of many, many modules. In the Maven world, those are Maven modules. Mm-hmm. Where do you kind of draw the lines there, and like when do you start to even think about that? Because for me, the multiple Maven modules is, hey, I have like these 4 or 5 different services that I work on, but I need a way to pull them into a single project because I'm working on all these different things in one IDE. I never, when are you just taking a project and going, this is all one code base, but I'm like splitting out this into different Maven modules?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of good guidance on this. I have seen times when it is useful. So even though I might not use this domain jar by itself or rely on it in some other project, from a testability across services, it can be useful to do kinds of contract testing. Like, I'm going to pull your domain and service and test it over here. But it's one of those things that I've played with and I find awkward. And so a good reason to do it, I don't have many. Not that there aren't any, but.
Well, if you are here with us and you're an expert on Maven modules and why I might want to split this out, please reach out. Let me know. I'd love to kind of include this in the discussion going forward.
Absolutely.
But with that, I want to get to kind of some of your stuff we were talking about before. And we've talked about package by layer. We've talked about package by feature. There are more ways that we can kind of split our code, and one of them is hexagonal architecture. Can you talk about this at a high level and what this is?
Yeah, so like I was saying before, if we think about separating, so again, like I come from testing, and when there's IO mixed in with other stuff, it makes testing hard. So how can we make testing easier is split the IO out. And so what I liked about hexagonal architecture is it basically said, there's an inside and an outside. There's the stuff that is basically the important thing. And so
do you want me to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm going to get to a slide and I'll have you share it.
Okay, no problem.
So you can share it now.
Okay, cool.
So what I love about hexagonal, and I'll say this just up front because it often gets asked, the number of sides is irrelevant. Alistair Coburn, who invented hexagonal architecture, sometimes refers to as ports and adapters, just wanted a different shape that had certain aspects of symmetry and so on. But the main thing, and we see this in other, what I call, so I kind of group a whole bunch of architectures under separation of concerns architectures. So onion and clean and even vertical slice to a certain extent. The whole idea is like, let's separate out the important stuff, the stuff that our business cares about,
Cool. I was going to
from
ask you
everything
about that
else.
because I hear the term
Yes.
onion, vertical
Yeah.
slice, like all
Yeah.
those things. So
At
those
a,
are
at a
all
high,
kind of fitting into this
there,
model then.
yeah, and so hexagonal has some specific ways of looking at it about how to interact with things, but they're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is comforting because it means, oh, we're on the right track if three different kinds or multiple different kinds of things are
Right.
doing this the same way. And this idea that there's an inside and an outside, and what's inside is really important. And not that what I ask, I mean, it doesn't do you any good if you've got a wonderful way of calculating the price of orders if you never can talk to anybody about it.
Right.
It's like, a brain that's very powerful that doesn't have a body. So we still need to talk to the outside world, but what goes inside is the application code. And I split this into two layers, where there's domain and then there's the stuff that's coordinating, right? Because you can have a product object, but where did it come from? Well, it has to be retrieved from somewhere. And if it's changed, we might have to let somebody know. So somebody has to just say, hey, something changed over here, or hey, here's the price, and that's the application layer. But basically, this is the stuff that doesn't do any I/O. It's fed all the information it needs, and it's what the business cares about. And so we'll find in here, inside the hexagon, this is the stuff that we can talk to the business about. We may talk to the business certainly about UIs and persistence, but we're probably not going to go through database tables with our business folks. They just want to know, is it saved somewhere, or is it performant, or whatever. And so the rest of the world is what we need to communicate with. And so there's and this goes back to Alistair's original write-up of this, which is there's sort of this input user side, which triggers stuff to happen. So inputs and requests come in, and then some kind of, right, they basically are driving the application.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really fascinating from a testing standpoint, is that the stuff that's sitting inside this hexagon is just sitting there. It's totally passive. It doesn't know anything about date, times, time passing by. It knows nothing because it may not even be loaded into memory. And at some point, somebody kicks something off and says, hey, do something. Like, click on a button to say, I want to buy this. And that's an input. It may come in as a direct input, may come in as a request through a message queue, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
And so something happens inside it, and maybe as a result, it drives something else. Hey, I now need to send an event to the warehouse to go and ship this order. Or maybe I first need to go and make sure that their payment went through. And so these are the outputs and events. So what I like about this way of looking at hexagonal, or just architecture in general, is there's this sort of left to right. Stuff comes in on the left, we do stuff with it. As a result, we may consult and then send information on the right.
And this sounds a lot like user stories from my day
Yeah.
of like working on teams. Like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm a user. I am going to fill out a registration form, and I want my user information saved on a system somewhere.
Right. And there are techniques of diving in a bit deeper into that, which is using event storming.
Yep.
To figure out what are all the things that happen, right? But it's always triggered by something that came into the realm of this system.
Yep.
And that's a great way of modeling this. And then you can pretty much apply those things, those different pieces. Well, here's an incoming thing. Okay, it goes here. Here's an outgoing thing. It goes there. And there's a place for everything, right? Going back to, like, it's nice to have a place to put stuff. Right. Even though there might be better ways to do it, this is a great way to start to sort of where do I put stuff.
So is there a way that we could break this down into very simple thing, like from a Spring perspective? What is on the inside of the hexagonal architecture? What is on the outside? So just at a very simple case, like, hey, I have this product or order, whatever it is, what might that look like?
Yeah, so here is, this is a project I've been working on for a couple of years. It's actually in production.
Cool.
What it does is, it's called Ensembler. What it does is it helps me schedule my mob programming ensembles. And it was written from scratch, TDD, hexagonal. And so what we can see is this is the package architecture. So at a high level, we've got the main package name. It used to be called mob.org. And then we have our application layer and our domain layer and our adapter layer. So application domain are inside the hexagon, and then there are adapters on the outside.
Okay.
And so, we can look inside. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, inside domain, what are we looking at?
Yeah, so inside domain, we have our the things that I care about as the guy who's, with my customer hat on. We have ensembles, and we have members, and they have status, and they have state, and there are events or basically exceptions that can happen, like they get canceled. And there's details about them that are maybe just value objects, records. And so this is domain stuff, and there's nothing in here that has anything to do with the outside world in terms of, it knows nothing about files, it knows nothing about databases. It's just, I'm an ensemble. I have a start, a title and a start date time and how long I am and some details about the conference.
And these are basically value objects.
Right. So that's the domain. It's very straightforward. And one of the nice things is then this is super easy to test, because I want to test an ensemble and I just instantiate it and call some methods. I don't need anything else. It does everything it needs to do because I'm testing directly that domain behavior.
Yeah, and sometimes you may not. So sometimes there may be no actual behavior inside of there, right? Maybe there's just getters and setters for this particular value object, but maybe there's a way to calculate some duration, right? So now you can write a test just against that.
Yeah.
And as you said, it doesn't matter from the outside what that looks like. It's just for this particular thing, I'm testing a duration, right?
Right. Right. Because I can test, hey, if we schedule it for this and then time passes, is it over? Right. So if it's scheduled for 2 hours and it's now 2 hours past the starting time, it should be over. If I ask it the question, are you over? In fact, there is a test for that. Are you? So there's a difference between completed and sort of is in the past. It can answer that question because it has all the information it needs. Then there's the question of, well, okay, how does this ensemble get loaded into memory, right? Which ensemble are we talking about? Well, it has an identifier, so we know we can find it somewhere in the outside world. Mm-hmm. And the thing that deals with that and coordinates that's this application layer. So I always look at the domain as this super dense core that knows nothing about the outside world, and then is surrounded by the application layer that helps fetch what it needs from the outside world, respond to things coming in from the outside world, loading up those domain objects and calling methods on it. And so we see, generally sort of naming convention ends up being something service. Whether that's a good name or not is a separate question. But this is now coordinating with the outside world. So one of the main thing that happens is when we change stuff, right? So here, hey, I'm providing a new meeting link because I changed the Zoom from one link to another. We generally save it when we're done. Sometimes, though, we will trigger a change. So not only we're going to save it in the database, but we're going to send out a notification to the people who can sign up for it. Hey, look, there's a new one that you can register for. Yeah. So that's what basically this is doing, right? So again, it's coordinating with, oh, we have changed it. Let me save it. And now let me send out a notification. And so the application layer coordinates with those different things.
It's responsible for all of that.
It doesn't know how it's notifying. All it knows is it calls. So if we look at this, all we know is there's been some ensemble scheduled, and this is all an interface. There's nothing here that says how people are being notified. And so now there's that separation between the idea and concept of notification and the implementation, which turns out to be email. Could be a text message, could be a Discord message.
Right.
But that, once you get down to that level of email and Discord message and text message, now you're talking about I/O.
Gotcha.
And that stuff sits in the adapter layer.
Gotcha.
Okay. And so there's inbound stuff. So the stuff that comes in, and for this application is basically only web. Yep. And this is where we'll find our controllers and authentication and all that kind of stuff. Controllers and forms and response objects and things like that. All that. And here you notice that I've got two different things. I've got admin and I've got member, because there's two different features used in two different ways. I'm the admin, and so I have a bunch of things that I do, like I invite people and I set up new ensembles. Members don't have that. They have a different set of things that they want to do. And so here I've divided it by features. So I haven't divided the entire application by feature. It's still layered. And
Mhm.
so if I were to make this multiple module, if I felt that that were something worthy, then you'd see sort of two parallel things with here's member stuff and here's admin stuff. But there's enough in common that that wasn't necessary. And
Cool.
so that's why I think you can actually sort of mix and match sort of feature and layer even in something like this.
Yep. So
And
then
then
what is the output?
yeah, and so then the out is all the stuff that we want to do from the application. It says, oh, I need to notify somebody. Well, that's probably going to be via email. So there's an emailer, and I use SendGrid to send my emails.
Yep.
There's obviously the retrieval and storage of information. So that's by Spring Data JDBC. Then I have to go and communicate with Zoom to go and create the event for me so I can get the event link. If I didn't want Zoom anymore, because maybe I don't like them for some reason, I could switch this out. And as long as it implements the interface, the video conference scheduler, which is inside the hexagon, I could substitute it. And I want to point out here that substitutability is useful, but it's not the main reason we do it this way. The main reason we do it this way is testing.
Testing. Yeah.
So I can basically test it, and I can provide a stub scheduler that always provides the same value, so I don't have to worry about actually communicating with the outside world.
Yep. Hey, I got a question here that says, is this open source? Wish there were more open source projects like this where we can learn from.
Yes, and I wish that too. One of the things and when I was searching through GitHub for all these Spring Boot projects, it was very frustrating because they were all very similar in not a good way.
Yeah.
And I can trace back some of that, like how did we get here? Certain tutorials that I would not recommend do it this way without explaining why. And so I wish too, but this project is open source. If you look for Ensembler under Ted Young, you'll find it, but I'm sure we'll be able to provide a link for it. And as Dan mentioned early on, this project was actually live coded from scratch. So you can watch all the videos of how I created it, and you will not want to sit down at one sitting because there's literally probably over 100 hours of video, and not all of it's up. But yeah, that's the Ensembler. Thank you for the link. But you can watch me like break down the work and do these things, and you can also see the refactoring. Like there are things I learned as I did this, as we all do, and things didn't work, and I'm currently in the process of adding a feature and taking away a feature. And so yeah, so it's all open source, and it's got a full suite of tests, of course, because it was done TDD.
That's great. Yeah, it's one thing to like put up a diagram and say, here's what you need to do.
Yes.
But being able to look at like a real world project like this kind of connects those dots for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I get frustrated by as sort of an educator is not enough examples. And examples are hard. I totally get that. I spend a lot of my time just coming up with good examples. But like you said, it's like, okay, we get the abstract thing, but like really what goes where? Right. Really, how do they talk to each other? Right. What does it actually look like? And we definitely need more examples.
Once you move past the hello world, where do things actually go in the real world?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So just to kind of like put a bow on this for now, I feel like we could talk about this for a long time.
Yeah.
You've mentioned one of the biggest pros is testability. Can you think of any other pros off the top of your head or cons to hexagonal architecture, or is it really start with testability? And
I think like the top three reasons are testability, and it's you know where to find stuff. But I think for me it's really which is really testability, right? Because I mean that's why and that's why I feel so strongly about focusing on testability. Is for me it drives so many other things. It tends to, doesn't automatically give you good design, but it tends to show you where you might have some problems. It also you can do things like I said, I have optionality, so I can say I don't want to use Zoom anymore for my video scheduler, or I want to add on another one like maybe God forbid, Microsoft Teams or Google Meet. Or I don't want to send by SendGrid anymore. I want to send with another vendor, or maybe I want to go directly and send it through something else.
Right.
Because each one is isolated, I can swap those out. Again, not going to do that very often, but it does happen. The other thing I want to point out is that if for some reason I didn't want to use Spring anymore, the application and domain layers do not depend on Spring.
Right. Right.
And so I've experienced this once in my career where we had to swap out the framework. We actually swapped out the drop wizard for Spring Boot. And boy, I wish we had done hexagonal architecture at that point, because it would have made that so much easier. We ended up having to rewrite large parts of it. So those are sort of the benefits. For me, it's mostly testability, but otherwise it's the ability to separate things.
And like you said, and I said earlier, like I really feel happy when I'm writing tests, because it does kind of point out some errors in my code. One of the things I am not good at is TDD. And can you quickly just kind of talk about TDD? I feel like when I do it, I'm like very happy that I did it. But when I don't do it, it's like, well, it's so much of an extra step to do. There's so much more going. I know that's not the case, but I feel like I just want to like write the real code that matters. What would you say to that?
So TDD is hard, not because the process itself is hard. Although I will plug my game, Jitter Test TDD game. So if you go to tddga.me, you can buy a copy of the game, and it basically it serves two functions. One is teach you the process, but also it's great for discussing. So I have a lot of folks who are coaches or coach adjacent, and one of the things they do is they use the game to provide a way to talk about it. Because one of the things that, if you're doing any kind of test-driven kind of thing, is there are trade-offs. There are times when maybe I'm not going to TDD this thing. And so understanding when to use it, I think, is important. If people say, well, if I'm prototyping something, it might get in my way. Absolutely. If you're exploring, totally.
That's a great point. Yeah.
It's like, don't use it. I use it because I'm really good at it. I tend to go faster, but there's stuff I will happily admit, inside Ensembler, the stuff that does the invites, I just wrote, because it's such a small thing. It basically generates a token, writes an entry in the database, and then it looks it up later. And it was just like, I didn't know how I wanted to do it, and I implemented it, and it worked, so I shipped it. I took the risk that it's a once in a while feature that's used, and if I felt like I needed more, then I could say, now I understand how it works, now let me TDD it. And so the difficulty that most folks have in doing TDD is not enough chance to practice it, because it is definitely a different way of thinking, and it very much ties with thinking in very, very tiny steps, which is also not the way that we were taught. We were taught, go implement this feature, you slam a whole bunch of code in, and then if you're good, you write some tests afterward. I did this for large parts of my career. And then you find stuff that didn't work, you find it hard to test, and you fix those up. But really this idea, and so Jeepa Hills, who's someone who greatly respect, talks about many more, much smaller steps. It's not the greatest acronym, but it's really important to say, how can I break this stuff down into small steps? And TDD really drives much better if you have smaller steps. But it's hard to start. With an existing code base that may not have great tests, it's just really hard to start.
Right.
And so what I suggest to people is you have to practice, preferably with someone who already knows how to do it. So this is why I teach TDD, not just in like an hour, here you go. It's in hours and hours and hours of practice with other people, with somebody who knows what they're doing, because it's not a skill that you can pick up in an hour or two or even 10. It really is a mind shift, which I think is the biggest part of it.
Yeah, and I'll plug Ted's YouTube channel again, because I went through some of your videos on TDD with hexagonal architecture, and just seeing your train of thought was really cool. And you mentioned in one of those videos, Was it zombie is taking
Zombies.
the small steps, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's 0,
Zero,
1, many.
1, many. Yeah. And so 0 and many is the idea of, sometimes if you're lucky enough to be starting with a new class, how do I start testing this thing? Well, it's like,
Right.
if you instantiate the class, what can you ask it? I can say, using one of my famous examples, the wallet example, I can ask it, are you empty? And it can respond true or false. Well, a new one is probably going to be empty. And then you can start talking about, okay, how would I check to see that it has a certain balance? Well, how do I get the balance a certain way? Oh, I can add money to it. Well, how do I check that works? And I can withdraw money, and so on. And so so you start with the 0 case, and then you start with the 1. If I add it once, does it work? If I add many times, does it work? And that can help you get started. Don't always need that, but it's a good place to start if you sort of
It really is.
don't know where to start.
Yep. No, I enjoyed that. Okay, just a couple more questions and we'll try and wrap up here. Why do I see a lot of experienced Java programmers using white theme?
Because we're old? I don't know.
I could speak for presentations. Like I use light themes whenever I'm presenting, usually if it's like a presentation online or especially in person, light themes kind of translate better. But I am very much a dark theme person when I'm writing my own code. So.
Yeah, I'm a light theme person because I'm old, for 2 reasons. One is, there was a reason why the original Macintosh back in 1984 was black on white, because studies have shown that actually it's easier to read. I have astigmatism, and it turns out dark on a light theme is much more readable.
Right.
I find the contrast to be better, and so that's why I stick with it.
Yeah, and I will say this, try not to get stuck with whatever everybody else is doing. You don't need a Mac. You don't need dark theme. You don't need all these things that you see on Twitter all the time. Whatever works for you, whatever you're most productive in, that is the right tool for the job. So yeah. There is a good book on hexagonal architecture called Get Your Hands Dirty with Clean Architecture.
Yes.
That's our friend Tom. How do you pronounce it? Helbergs, yes.
Yeah. That came out. The second edition just came out fairly recently.
Right. I actually own the first edition. I have it back here on the bookshelf, and I have not gone all the way through it.
I would say I disagree with some of the stuff, but mainly because I diverge somewhat from sort of pure hexagonal in certain ways. But otherwise, I think it's an okay book. Yeah.
Cool. Just looking through here. To what extent can features depend on each other while trying to achieve low coupling? I mean, that's a loaded question of how big should my components be?
I mean, so there's a presentation that I'm watching from Vlad Kononov on balancing coupling, and he's got a book coming out on it. And coupling isn't a bad thing. Right? Because if you don't have any coupling, you've got things that can't talk to each other and you can't get anything done. Right. So you got to have some coupling. And so to me, if the features are clearly delineated, then they call public methods on them, and that should be fine. Right. And if it's not, then you've got a problem in how you define basically the API for that package or for that module.
Yeah, and I like using some of those diagram tools that kind of point this out to you. If you spit all your code out into a diagram and everything's talking to everything, then it's okay.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, and it was mentioned earlier, a tool called ArcUnit. So if you go to arcunit.org. So I use this to basically enforce hexagonal architecture, so I don't accidentally have, oops, I've got my domain depending on importing something from an adapter. That's bad. That's not the way it should work. And so you can run that as it's part of your continuous integration. It's basically runs under JUnit. It's probably too slow in some cases to run all the time, but fast enough that you could run it, do pre-commit. And basically it'll tell you, oops, you've got a dependency that's wrong. You've got an adapter. In hexagonal, adapters cannot depend on each other. They must remain independent. So you want to enforce that. And so ArcUnit will help you do that.
Yep. One more comment here. I don't need a Mac, but I want to be like Ted. I agree.
I was a Windows person forever until I joined Apple. When you work at Apple, you get a Mac. And now I can't switch away from it because I actually really like got to like Macs, and also B, my fingers know the shortcuts on a Mac.
Yeah. Once you get hooked into it, it's tough to get away. Cool. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we'll end it there. We went a little long, but like I said, we probably could talk about this forever.
We could talk about this. So I'm gonna do one more plug, if that's okay.
No, I was gonna say, before we get into all the kind of closing stuff, please let us know where we can find some more information on everything we talked about today with what you're up to. So
yeah, so you mentioned my YouTube channel. If you go to jitterted.tv, that takes you right to my YouTube channel. I've got a whole bunch of videos, many from my live coding stream, but some specific hour-long webinars on hexagonal that I think are a really good place to start. And like you said, like you can see me do it, but I do have a course that I've been working on for far too long, refactoring to hexagonal architecture, that basically plug the Twitch. Yes, so jitterted.live or jitterted.stream is where I do my live coding. I have to get back on that, and I'll probably do that. TED.dev is my website. So if you go to TED.dev, you'll see articles and other videos and things like that. And you'll find out my Discord community. So I have a Discord community where we talk about this stuff. And I learn so much from my community, because mainly sometimes they suggest things, and sometimes they ask a question. It's like, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. Let's go figure that out. And so I get some of my material from the questions that people ask. So it's a free community. If you go to TED.dev Discord, you'll find it.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, I think I'll echo that. Like, again, this is kind of the beginning of the conversation for me, at least with this community. We did the video last week on kind of layer versus feature. I want to get in and get my hands dirty with clean architecture, or whatever the title is. I want to get my hands dirty with some hexagonal architecture, and because it's enough to, it's something to talk about it, but until you can really start to do it and see the pros and benefits of going a different route, you won't really know the advantages. Right. So I definitely want to get in there and create some applications using this approach. And I would love the community to do the same. I saw a lot of feedback on package by layer versus package by feature. Get out there, create some applications using this approach, and let us know what you think. Let's keep this conversation going forward. And like I said, we're going to try and get we've got Oliver scheduled. We're going to get Oliver, the lead for Spring Modulathon. So he'll kind of give us his perspective. I love listening to Oliver's perspective on architecture, Spring in general. It's going to be a fun one. So we'll kind of take this another step further and see what he has to say.
Awesome.
So what do you have there? TED.dev. This is your website. And I know you can click on the different tags, and I went on one of the hexagonal architecture tags, and then there were all the blog posts.
Yeah, so this is the latest talk I gave to the Philly XP meetup.
Awesome.
This one talks about my ensemble project structure. And so you may not have noticed, so eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed, podcast listeners will not have noticed, but the eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed that there's a coloring in the project window. That. So in my diagrams, my hexagonal architecture diagrams, I've colored everything. And these colors match. In fact, I have a YouTube video on how I did the coloring, because IntelliJ lets you do that. So domain stuff is in yellow, application is in this peach orange, inbound adapters are in this light blue, and outbound adapters in this sort of lavender purple. And it's really nice because IntelliJ, at least in the old UI, the DUI, sorry, JetBrains, you've got work to do there, in my opinion. With the old UI, the tabs, as you can see, the tab colors reflect that file color, and still give you good contrast. So the coloring stuff, I think, is really nice, because it's almost subconscious or unconscious, and it's like, oh, I'm in the domain, so I'm doing this kind of thing.
Awesome. Cool. All right, and then I see you have you're at JitterTed on Twitter, Twitch, everywhere.
Yep. Yeah, JitterTed on Twitter, JitterTed at SFBA Social on Mastodon.
Cool.
Ted M. Young on LinkedIn. I'm actually fairly active on LinkedIn these days.
Yep.
And yeah.
Cool. Well, Ted, I really appreciate you coming on. I always enjoy our talks. I'm glad we got to like meet in person this year and talk in person.
Yeah.
That was really great. I hope we
great.
have many more conversations like this. I appreciate it.
I hope so too. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye.